No pun intended, right? Glad you could come. I wanted to go over briefly what we're going to be doing here, talking about today. Can you hear me well enough in the back? Okay. So, yeah, I can move this closer. How's that? That's a little bit better? Okay. So, IR upgrades. If I say IR, I hope you know that I'm talking about infrared lighting, and how FAA is committed to converting the lighting of towers with infrared light, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. What I wanted to, well, just real briefly to reintroduce myself. I'm working for a company, Unimar, and they've been around since 1989. And the main industries that we support are telecommunications, broadcast, and the utility and industrial industry. And our products are literally sold around the world. So as far as obstruction lighting of towers, mostly what we're going to focus on today is on the red light, okay? If you want to learn about white light, that'll be a different time. But briefly, what I'm going to go over is the process you need to consider if you are going to upgrade or if you need to change infrared lighting, whether or not you can replace your existing red light with the same type of red light if it does not have IR, and when it is that you need to replace. I'm going to also cover a brief review of tower lighting configurations and the difference between red and dual lighting systems. And if we have some time, I'm going to brush on the avian standards, which have to do with the flashing of red lights, and some lighting options for painted towers, and a little bit of monitoring and compliance. So I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers, and I suppose there'll be more questions than there are answers, but I'll do my best to help you out with that. And so as far as infrared goes, if you have an existing lighting system and it is not IR, you'd seem to think that you are grandfathered in, right? Well, yes, you are, kinda. The FAA is not saying you've got to change your lights to infrared because that's the new standard. They're going to allow you to continue to operate your system as long as it's viable. So what comes into play is whether your current lights are still certified by FAA. So when a light is certified by FAA, it goes through this process, and they say, yeah, we're putting our stamp of approval on this light. It's certified for lighting obstructions, and this certification will expire in 3 years or 5 years. I'm not exactly sure what the time frame is, but they don't come back and say, oh, your light's not certified anymore. They just, at the very onset, they just tell you when the certification will expire. So if you have, oh yeah, and the other thing is that manufacturers, certainly with the sale of new lighting systems, we can't sell a system now with red lights that does not have IR. We're just not allowed to. We can replace older lights, and we're allowed to sell the older lights just as long as they have maintained their certification. So if you've got light X, and light X still has a certification, you can order light X and replace the light you've got out. If it's no longer certified, FAA says you need to find a light that is certified and replace it with IR, okay? So, I think I covered that sort of stuff already. The next thing I want to do is just cover, maybe give you an example of how you would go through this process of figuring it out. Because if you do have to replace a light with an infrared, it matters where on the tower the light is located. So what I've got up here is a tower configuration, lighting configurations for towers that are painted in the scheme of aviation orange and white. If you have a tower that has this painting scheme, the FAA says you can light it with just red light at night only, okay? If the tower was not painted in this scheme, then you would have to go to probably a dual lighting system, but it also depends on the height of your tower, obviously. So you can see the shortest tower up on the screen is really, that's more like for water towers and for buildings. That would be a steady burning light. The next tallest tower is classified as an A1. So currently the lighting system for an A1, you have a flashing beacon at the top, and then you have 3 obstruction lights, low intensity lights at mid-level, okay? If your tower is lit like that right now, you have an older system, those mid-level lights are probably on steady burn. In other words, they're lit all the time. The newest standards would have those obstruction lights flashing and synchronized with the top beacon, okay? And that's part of the avian standards. Yes? Okay, so the question was, in an A1 tower configuration, are you required to have 2 or 3 side marker lights? Is that what you're asking? The guideline says at least 2 or 3. So, it kind of depends on the structure of your tower. And just what they want is they want you to have the light visible from every angle, right? So let's go through an example of an A1 tower and how you might, let's say your beacon went out, the top light went out, and you check and your light is no longer certified. So you need to upgrade to an infrared light. So you call your vendor, they give you the product that you need, how you're gonna put it into your lighting system. You replace it, that becomes the infrared light at the top. If your lighting system supports the obstruction lights that you've got at mid-level with the lighting control you have and so on, you don't have to replace the lower lights. Okay, you can just replace the top light. But what happens if your mid-level lights go out, your obstruction lights go out at mid-level? Well, if your light is not certified, then, and you need to replace that with an infrared light, the FAA says that if you start replacing lights with infrared, the topmost light has to be infrared as well. So in that case, if you replaced the mid-level lights with infrared, you would also have to replace the beacon with infrared. Oh, that makes sense? Now, let's go on to the next tallest tower, which is an A2. up to 700 feet. The newest tower lighting configuration on that is just a top flashing medium intensity beacon, and then mid-level 2 flashing medium intensity beacons. If you have a tower, if you have an E2 tower now, the old lighting configuration would have had, I believe it has those beacons, but it also has in between those levels the obstruction lights, solid burning, low intensity lights that are not flashing. If you went to upgrade your A2 system to IR, you could eliminate those low intensity obstruction lights that were at 1/4 and 3/4 of the height of the tower. Does that make sense? Okay. Now another scenario with the A2 that you might be able to save yourself some money on or some trouble is if you had a mid-level flashing medium intensity beacon go out that you needed to replace, okay? And the light you have is no longer certified, so you've got to get an IR light to replace it, correct? But if you do that, the top light has to be infrared too. What the FAA says you can do, though, is you can take the non-IR light that's on top, bring it down to the mid-level, still use it because it's still a working light, and replace the top light with infrared. So then you've got the infrared light at the top like they want. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned is, well, what's the infrared thing about? It's really designed so that its true purpose is so that pilots with night vision goggles can see the light. They can pick up infrared. Okay, they can't pick up just the regular red light that's being emitted. All right, so that's the whole design behind the infrared. So just to give you a few numbers to look at, you can see that the lighting intensity for the L864 medium intensity red beacon is 2,000 candelas, and the L810 low intensity are much lower. They're 32 candela. All right. I'm going to move on. Okay, so I'm going to touch briefly on dual lighting systems. And these dual lighting systems are for towers that do not have the painting scheme of orange and white. So here, the tallest tower, a tower over 350 feet, is still going to have 3 beacons, but it's going to be white day and red at night, with 2 beacons mid-level. An E1, which is the same height as an A1 tower, if it's not painted, you would have a dual beacon at the top and 3 low intensity mid-level obstruction lights. So this is something that you could consider going forward. As far as, I'm going to jump ahead out of order here on my slides. If you have a tower that is painted orange and white, does anybody have an idea of what it costs to repaint one of these towers? Jim, I think you told me earlier, right? Okay, and how tall was that tower? So 205-foot tower, $35,000 for repainting, okay? And that's for an A2 level tower, okay? If you converted to an E2 tower, didn't want to repaint, you could convert, I think in the I'm just gonna throw out a rough range, anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 for an E2 system, okay? To go from A2 to E2 without having to repaint the tower. The other things that would come into play in replacing your old lighting system is the trouble you have to go through in maintaining an incandescent light system. You know, I had a customer stop by earlier who was telling me that he replaced a couple of bulbs in July, and 6 weeks later he had a light go out again. You know, so it can become it can really contribute to continued expenses. LED lights are known for their long-lasting durability. And I didn't mention that before, but the IR lights are also LED. So you have the benefit of much less energy consumption. I think comparatively LEDs use 90% less energy than an incandescent light would. So I'm going to skip back up here a slide or two. So briefly, I'm going to talk about avian standards. And if you don't know what these are, avian refers to birds, and we all like birds. But the FAA has gotten pressure from environmental communities, and they work closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, and all those, and they came up with some standards to help minimize the death of migrating birds. So they found that migrating birds often would gravitate toward steady burning lights, and they found that if they blinked them, that they didn't gravitate them to them. Weren't attracted to them so much. So what happens is, as they fly towards the steady burning lights, they tend to strike the guy wires or the towers themselves. And so it's just a helpful thing to our, the wildlife that we like out there. It isn't something that the FAA is making you do. It's just a guideline if you wanted to help out. So you could also consider why it might be helpful to convert to avian standards. It really it depends on the system type you have, the age of it. As I mentioned, if you switch from incandescent or xenon, the operational costs are going to be lower, and energy savings, and so on. So, covered that slide. Oh, just real briefly, if you were upgrading to an E2 system, obviously it's a lot more than an A2 system, a dual light system from a red light system. An option, if it's not in your capital expenditures budget, there are companies that do lease tower lighting systems, so that's an option. And I guess from an accounting point of view, if you're leasing something, you can expense it every time you pay it, whereas a capital expenditure has to be depreciated over so many years. So it's a thing for the bean counters to look at, right? And then briefly, I want to just touch on compliance and what our responsibilities are to make reports about our lights functioning on the towers and how you're supposed to do that. So the FAA, they don't mandate anything. They make guidelines, they make recommendations for marking and lighting. But if you have a structure that has an antenna registration number, then you fall under the guise of FCC. And it's the FCC that mandates things. And they're the ones that can administer fines if they deem appropriate and so on. So they want you to keep records that you are monitoring your lights correctly. There are ways to do that. Anything from hiring an Aunt Bessie to look at your light every day and make sure it's on, or down to a full service monitoring service that a vendor can provide for you. And so the FCC mandates that if you have any top light or any flashing light that goes out, you have to file a NOTAM. Tracy said, I can't say NOTAM anymore, I gotta say NOTAM. So I guess it depends on who you talk to, but. So if you haven't heard of that before, a NOTAM is a Notice to Air Missions, or Notice to Airmen, and it's something you file with the FAA so that they can report the light outage for aviation, okay? And they also require that you file it within 30 minutes of a light failure. So you do want to have, effective ways of monitoring your lights so that you are, you don't subject yourself to fines and put aircraft safety at risk. That's really what it comes down to. Just wanted to show you this form real quick. If you haven't heard of it, FAA Form 7460 is an application that you would make for a new structure, and also if you were going to make an alteration to a structure. So if you wanted to change your lighting system from an A2 red light only to a dual lighting system, then you would need to file this form with them. And they would get back to you and say, yeah, that's a good idea, let's do that. It's not a long, arduous process. It's a pretty simple form. Any modification or alterations to the lighting, you would need to fill out one of these forms. So I'd like to open it up to questions at this point. If you have anything I didn't cover or I wasn't clear about. Yes.
Light certifications, is there a place to see if your light is still certified? And also, if your light is not certified but it's still functional, can you still keep running that?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you find out whether your light is certified? You can go on to the FAA website, and they have a list by manufacturer that tells you whether your light is certified. And the other question was, can you continue to use a light if it's not certified? Yes, you can. As long as it's still operating and burning, they're not asking you to go out and replace all your lights. Yes, so this form 74, the question was if you want to eliminate the steady burning, low intensity lights on your tower, and that's a modification or an alteration. So this form, FAA Form 7460-1, you would need to file that and get their approval. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. So, do you know for sure, Tracy?
I know that when we did Lolo's, they included an AM3 power directional system. We changed from incandescent to LEDs, and we didn't have kept the same antenna structure registration numbers and stuff. All we had to do was let them know that we're
Okay, so I don't know if I repeated the question, but the question was, if you do go through the process of changing or altering your lighting, do you need to report that to the FCC with your antenna registration? Answer was no.
You need to change your ASR. Change your ASR.
Yeah, the ASR does not change. That's, okay.
Do you know if anybody is making a replacement 610-watt bulb for your old-fashioned 32-inch beacon that had dual bulbs? You know, I know when you change the LED, obviously you're dropping the height down substantially, but I just didn't know if there's an approved bulb that has the bayonet mount that would go into an old-school light.
The old school incandescent beacon bulbs you're talking about, I've had I know just from my personal experience at our company, our supplier is not providing that bulb anymore. So we're having, you know, most customers are then just replacing it with the newer lighting system.
The entire fixture.
Yes. Yeah, that would mean removing the incandescent and, you know, going to the IR LED beacon. Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of your question. Can you repeat it? I'm a little hard of hearing. I actually asked my boss that question because I wasn't sure. And he said, no, you do not have to file a change or alteration if you're changing from incandescent to infrared. Yes. Now, if you did go and change to the avian standards and using flashing obstruction lights, you would have to do that. Did I answer all of your question?
Just follow up maybe other examples of what types of changes.
Good question. Think about that. Well, you know, if you come up with something, you can call me and I'll give you the answer right now. Actually, I just don't have one that comes to mind. If I think of something, I'll bring it up. Okay? Anybody else? Yes.
Just a little point of clarity, you were saying about the incandescent to LED, you wouldn't need, if you did the same scheme, you wouldn't need to file a form. But all LED or all red lights now are IR, so that would require you to file a form, would it not?
They're not requiring you to report a change moving from regular red light to infrared light. Because it really doesn't, the only thing it changes is it just increases the visibility for night vision goggles.
Who do you typically see night vision helicopters?
Well, yeah, certainly military train with it. I'm not aware of who else would be using it, honestly, the night vision goggles.
I'm thinking, you know, if you have a 250-foot tower, and an airplane hits you, you've got a problem. But yet, when you have a medical helicopter, they're doing scene responses and such, and they tend to be much lower, or TV helicopter. But, you know, an airplane, typically, if he's at 200 feet, he's got a problem. Unless it's by an airplane. Right, if it's on a flight path, sure. Yeah, I mean, if it's on a flight path, you can have a 50-foot tower, and that's, yep.
Yeah, so the tower configurations I was going over with you on, it's, you know, FAA makes determinations not just on the height of the tower alone. If it didn't get picked up on the recording, the comment was that, you know, helicopters and near airports are, you know, more risky as far as collisions with obstructions to aviation. So when an FAA is doing a study for a new obstruction or something that is being erected near an airport, then there's other considerations that come into play for lighting those structures, not just height alone. So, yes. Did you think of another example?
No, another scenario dealing with lighting. So you're talking about the different, you know, typically anything under 200 is not need lights unless it's in a flight path or, you know, other criteria. But in Pennsylvania, I think we have 3 towers right near each other that were all under over 200 feet. And one of our guys called for another one because one of the tower lights went out. Somebody else came back and said, well, that one doesn't need it because the other one's red. And so how does that fall into the
Okay, so I think what you're describing is what towers, if you've got a couple of towers in close proximity, correct? Yeah, there are waivers for lighting obstructions if you've got towers or other things in close proximity that wouldn't require you to light both structures. So if you've got one properly lit and the other one is within a certain distance, and that's all within, it's in the advisory by the FAA, where it lists all their guidelines. It would tell you at what distance, you know, you did not have to relight another tower. The advisory that, I wouldn't really call it my Bible, but it is my reference tool at work. The FAA advisory, it's AC 746-1M, I think. That is something I refer to all the time. It's got individual chapters on red lighting, on dual lighting, on lighting of all kinds of different structures. Talks about painting. So if you just Googled FAA lighting standards, you would come up with that document. If you want me to send you a copy, just give me your business card or your email address, and I can easily forward it to you. It's not a large, it's a relatively compact PDF form or document, I should say. I was walking around the city here while I've been here. I noticed there's a big crane doing some construction on a building, and it's got some obstruction lights on it. You know, it's part of that whole scheme. And there's also a couple of very tall antenna towers to the west of us, I think it is. And they've got, if you're not familiar with the painting schemes, those towers are painted the orange and white. But one of them must be so tall, or they wanted to provide extra safety. It actually has some flashing white light during the day. So I don't know what the specific requirements are for lighting that tower, but that's one where it's just not it's not necessarily straightforward. But one of the things that a vendor like Unimar is supposed to do is to provide the proper recommendations for FAA lighting standards. Like if somebody says, "Oh, I want to light this tower such and such a way," And we know the FAA standards, and we determined that, no, that is not proper, that would be a hazard, then we will not sell something like that to the customer because it is not compliant. We're required by the FAA to sell compliant lighting systems. Yes, question in the back? I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Whoever's responsible, I mean, if you're going out there to do some work on a tower, are you required to file the form with the FAA? I believe it's responsibility of the registered owner. But you could certainly file it on their behalf. If I'm correct, if anybody knows something different, let me know, but I think that's how it works. Way in the back?
So to file a change on a 7460-1 tower, does it have to be brought up to current standards? And I ask that because I maintain a 300-foot tower that's lit or was lit to very old standards, one top beacon, two sets of steady burning side burners. Okay? We upgraded it to LEDs with, top marker, top beacon, one set of side burners built. And before I could get corporate to file the paperwork to change the ASR, to change the standard as they were doing there for about every year and a half, they changed the standard to require infrared lighting, which I don't have. So I'm stuck with a tower with an infrared ASR with nice LED, nice bright LED, non-infrared lights. Could I upgrade that ASR but not bring it up to infrared standard?
That's a complicated question. I'm going to try to answer it the best I can, and I'm going to repeat it a little bit, make sure I understand it. So you've got an existing lighting system, a former lighting configuration, correct?
Well, it would be current except for, we're not flashing the center beacon, the center side bar, and there's no infrared. So it was current at the time we put it up, we just didn't get everything changed, and now the standards changed again.
So did you purchase the lighting system to have it replaced?
Yeah.
All right, so,
I didn't buy, well, yeah, I bought the new lights and have them installed.
okay, so they're installed.
Yeah.
So I don't see that you're non-compliant, that you know, at the,
It does match the ASR.
well, the ASR would, you didn't change from white to red only or anything like that. So the ASR would, it's the aeronautical study that tells you whether it's supposed to be red light or white light. I don't believe the ASR goes into that much detail. So if your original application was non-IR, is that correct?
Well, it's with the standards of the 1970s. It was, we just brought it up to the current, we put the cart before the horse, we put the current lighting standard at the time with nice LED lights on there. And by the time, it must have been 3 days later, the FAA said, oh, you gotta use infrared now. And we don't have infrared on there, and we're still on the old standard. Variable. And we want to get the ASR so it's accurate.
Yeah, I might need to follow up on this question. I don't want to answer it inaccurately. My impression is that you've replaced your lighting with LED. Did you convert from incandescent to LED?
Yeah.
Okay, so, and you kept the same lighting scheme?
No, we went to a fluorescent, what was a fluorescent at the time, like the two sets of side markers, the one set in the middle. It used to be they were all equal spaced, but there were hundreds of them around the building.
I guess it would be my suggestion to, you know, ask somebody in more in authority. I don't know if I can answer that question. Sorry.
If I may state, my understanding, if you replace in kind, there's a lot of, let's be honest, I mean, in powers have been on, if you're replacing in kind, FAA does not care what the light source is. Whether it's incandescent, Unimar, whatever. So your office said, right, so, so if you filled out the FAA form, there's a period of time that you're grandfathered in to older standards because the FAA did not specifically say you need to replace the tower and mark it according to 1M. You know, they're still under old standards. So I would think you'd be able to get or send in a 7460 form and reference the standard that you installed, which would probably been A. So can I just put a note on that, we upgraded our system to the latest standard at the time, so you're still in now. Because you did alter your training, so I would just put a note in there saying that you brought your tower up to this standard. And at least then your registration reflects what your house.
That was a good question. Okay? We all set? All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.